Yeah. So I think the critical part of the landscape that's changed is just the fundamental economics of it. It was easier to push the fact that solar is intermittent and therefore unreliable when it was also expensive. But when it starts to be significantly cheaper, from a system point of view, it makes a whole lot more sense to include it within the system. And so when you're talking to policymakers about economics and saving and lowering costs, that's a far more interesting discussion than if you're having a discussion about environmental climate change. And I find in all the political economy work that we do in Southeast Asia, we very rarely mention climate. It's all about the economic decisions. So it's about security of supply, lowering costs, and the risk of volatile fossil fuel costs and dependency. And so in Australia, as the costs lowered, even when you had a market where the political environment, the previous 10 years from 2009 to 2019, there wasn't a lot of political support for renewable energy, but the market really drove a lot of that demand. So customer choice in rooftop solar was part of that demand. And then the other part of that demand was corporate and decisions that were being made at the federal level. For example, in Canberra, the state government, the territory, made a decision that they wanted to buy 100% renewable energy. The government put out tenders for renewable energy projects. They put out tenders for solar, they put out tenders for wind, they put out tenders for batteries, and they went to market and signed CFD, contracts for difference. And so they basically underpinned a lower price and a maximum price. And since about 2017, been running on 100% renewable energy. And so when the federal government wasn't so strong on renewable energy, the state and territory governments were driving that demand. And then also the corporate demand. So companies like Apple, Microsoft, a lot of the universities wanted to buy 100% renewable energy. And with the market the way it's set up, you can do those types of contracts to purchase solar and wind power to supply. The cost competition and the availability of customers being able to choose what they want, either through rooftop solar, corporate or state customers, that made a really big difference. And now you see companies like Rio Tinto signing Australia's largest solar and wind projects to supply their massive demand. I was looking at battery storage back in 2014 at the Australian market. And back in 2014, it was still a bit expensive. And at that time, everyone was talking about defection from the grid, because what you had was the incumbents, the network companies and the retailers that were saying, we don't rooftop solar. Yes, the government might be subsidizing it through a feed-in tariff or a subsidy through the renewable energy target for small scale upfront cost, but they weren't particularly keen on it. The only reason they started to play ball was they realized that if they didn't, then customers would do exactly as you've said. They would install solar and defect from the grid and just say, you're expensive and you're not meeting my needs. I'll get batteries with my rooftop solar. I don't need to worry anymore. Now, from a society point of view, I actually don't think that's a great outcome, because the infrastructure is there. And if everyone has a battery and a solar system on their roof, it actually isn't the most efficient way to go about doing it. It is some way towards it, and it's really valuable. But there is actually, I think AEMO did an analysis where they said if everyone goes off the grid, then everyone will need a little tiny diesel genset in their backyard for the 1 or 2 or 3 hours a year where they can't get it from solar and storage.